Welcome back to Learn with Chris. I'm Chris. Today I'm going to talk about Odin as the god of poetry. My last video about Odin was Odin as the god of death, and I did say in that video that I would, the next video would be about Odin as the god of knowledge. However, I think that's quite large. It's going to be a very big video about knowledge, because I think that's primarily Odin's role and domain, and it's what I'm personally most interested in. Maybe that's my particular draw towards Odin, is as Odin as a god of knowledge. So that's kind of like the let's call it the magna opus. So that's going to be the biggest video probably I'm going to make. So let's do poetry first, and let's do knowledge last. So leave the best for last, basically. So let's talk about Odin today as a god of poetry. There's three kind of areas for this. The first is that there's a lot of poems in the Poetic Edda involve Odin talking with other people, giving knowledge, and it could be considered poetry. The examples of these, four poems to talk about, is the Vafthrûdnismál, very hard words to say, Grimnismál, Harbáths Hlöth, something hard to say that word, and Lokasenna. So quickly, Vafthrûdnismál was basically a riddle contest between Odin and a giant, Vafthrûdnir. His name might be translated as like Riddle Master. And a lot of information comes out of this, but I think my idea here is these four poems, I think they're more connected with Odin as a god of knowledge, not poetry. So once, as we talked about death having crossover with knowledge, also poetry has a crossover with knowledge as well. So I'm not going to put a lot of detail into any of these four poems today. I might for the knowledge one video, but not now. I just want to mention them briefly. So Vafthrûdnismál, Odin's riddle contest with the giant Vafthrûdnir. One of the, a lot of information, basically we learn a lot. There's a lot of questions in this. Think Hobbit when Bilbo finds the ring and he's in the cave, and then Gollum basically comes up to him and says, I forget exactly the details, but Gollum is looking for the ring. Bilbo has it in his pocket, and they engage in a riddle contest. And remember that the last question, which Bilbo ends up winning that riddle contest, is, what is in your pocket, right? Something like that. I forget the exact lines from the Hobbit about that, but it's a riddle contest between Bilbo and Gollum. Well, Vafthrûdnismál is a riddle contest between Odin and Vafthrûdnir. Similar idea, and the ending of it also is a similar. Again, my point is that Tolkien drew inspiration from Norse stories. I've talked about this already, and we'll continue to talk about it as more examples pop up. So the example here is at the end of this particular poem. The riddle that Vafthrûdnir couldn't answer was when Odin asked him, what did Odin whisper into the ear of Balder at Balder's funeral? And nobody knows what Odin said to his dead son Balder. Vafthrûdnir couldn't answer the question, so Odin ended up winning the challenge. So while we could talk about Vafthrûdnir, very hard to say, Vafthrûdnismál, the poem, as an example of poetry, Personally, I think it's an example of knowledge. It's an example of God, Odin as the god of knowledge and wisdom. The next one to quickly talk about is Grimnismal. I've talked about this one already. This is where Odin was captured and tortured, and the prince or the son of the king who captured him helped Odin. Again, Odin is not Odin in any of these stories except for Lokasenna. He's always disguised as someone else. So Odin disguised as someone else is given some help by the son. I forget his name, Angmar or something. I forget his name. Never mind. But and then Odin gives him a whole bunch of information. Again, maybe not poetry related, but knowledge related. Now another very hard, very hard name of a poem, Harbof's Hloth. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but this one is like the insult contest between Odin and Thor over like a river, like at a ferry. Again, could be looked at as poetry, but also probably as knowledge. And the last one, Lokasenna. Lokasenna is the insults of Loki, a very famous poem. This is in Asgard, and Loki is just insulting all of the gods. And he does also insult Odin at this point as well. Again, all of these could be considered aspects of Odin as the god of poetry. I don't personally think so. I think they're more related to knowledge. So I'm going to pause about that for now. So the second thing about Odin as the god of knowledge is about, Odin as the god of poetry is about skaldic poetry, and the fact that skaldic poetry was pretty much only for nobility, for the jarls, for the kings. It was the entertainment for the kings. And Odin was the god of nobility. He was the god worshipped by the kings and the jarls and the nobility. So remember that the common Viking, the common Norse person, the raider or the fisherman or the farmer, the common man or woman in Norse society, they didn't worship Odin directly. They primarily worshipped Thor, Freya, and probably Njolf. And the reason for that is that Thor, of course, was the god of thunder, the god of rain, storms, so water. So that's of course related to like agriculture, of course. Freya was the god of prosperity, farming. Freya, the goddess of like love, fertility, and Njolf was the god of the sea, so it'd be like related to fishermen. So the activities that the average person would engage in, like fishing and farming and such, that's what the common person did. So those were the gods that they were particularly focused on. And of course, Thor was also seen as the protector, the guardian, the protector of, not just the protector of the gods, but also the protector of Midgard, protector of humans, right? So a lot of affection towards Thor. But the average person, there's not much archaeological evidence of average people worshiping Odin, not at all. He was the god of the nobility. He was the god of the kings and the jarls. And skaldic poetry was the entertainment for the kings. The average peasant wouldn't know how to do skaldic poetry, wouldn't know anything about it, and it would pretty much fly right over their heads. As I'm going to talk about it in a minute, and this is some pretty complicated stuff. But hold on. So skaldic poetry is there's all these rules for how it works. So you have like you're gonna have like 8 lines in the poem, and there has to be like 6 syllables in every line, and there's all of these rules that make it really, really hard to compose it, to make it, right? So there's like half rhyming, and there's full rhyming, and there's alliteration of different consonants. there's all of these rules that make it extremely difficult to construct skaldic poetry and even to understand it. So it's kind of like high level ability, right? And the kings, the jarls, they would invite these skalds to tell their poems, right? Again, seen as again the connection with Odin as the god of poetry, right? Because the people who worshipped him were involved, the kings and the nobility, they were involved in this skaldic poetry. So that's a connection with Odin as the god of poetry, was the fact that skaldic poetry was done for the nobility and for the kings. But skaldic poetry is really complicated, and when you read it, even if you constructed it in English today, it because of all of the rules that you need to do to actually correctly follow all of the rules of skaldic poetry, which was set down by Snorri Sturluson in the Poetic Edda, I think. I think that's where you find the rules. But it's really hard to kind of know what you're reading, even if it's in English today. Just reading through it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the skalds means poets, by the way. The skalds would construct their skaldic poetry, and they would probably be, saying good things about the king, or, congratulating him on a battle. It could be about love, whatever it was. But yeah, so that's related with Odin as the god of poetry. But the main connection with Odin as the god of poetry is the Mead of Poetry. And this story is from the Poetic Edda, Skáldskaparmál, chapters 5 and 6. Now, okay, so let me tell you kind of a bit of story for myself. As I mentioned in the Odin video at the beginning, as a Dungeons and Dragons player, we talked about like the domains of the gods, right? So I'm quite familiar with role-playing games. And a few years ago, I was running a game, I think it was Conan, and it had a Norse focus. And in that game, the player characters were going to go find, they were going to go steal actually the Mead of Poetry, and I was setting up the story of the Mead of Poetry, and one of the player characters was a skald, and I sent a whole bunch of Facebook messages to that player. I don't want to say his name, but I sent the messages to him such that he could get the background information about the Mead of Poetry, because I wanted him in character to introduce the Mead of Poetry to the other players to kind of set the background, and then the players would go on the adventure to steal the Mead of Poetry. I believe they failed when they actually went. They went to a wedding, and there was just too many gods there that they were unable to actually steal it. So they failed at their particular mission. But what I'm going to do though is I'm actually going to copy and put the posts that I wrote to him from Facebook. I'm going to put them up on the screen. I'm going to read through them. And this is effectively a paraphrasing of Skáldskaparmál 5 and 6. So it's a paraphrasing through the entire Mead of Poetry story that I wrote, paraphrasing it for that player to understand. I think it probably would do the same value in this video. Okay, so I'm going to read through this messages that I sent my friend on Facebook Messenger, and I'm going to explain it as I go through it. And it's more or less a paraphrasing of the Mead of Poetry story, and of course this is strongly connected with Odin, of course. So it begins. Let me tell you of the Mead of Poetry and how it came to be. A long time ago, the first war the realms had ever known started when the Aesir with their spears smote Gulveig, a Vanir witch woman. They killed her 3 times, burned her body 3 times in Odin's halls, but she was reborn 3 times. It is said that the Aesir feared the scythe magic of Gullveig, or perhaps they were jealous of it. Regardless, war erupted between the Aesir and the Vanir. The First War. Odin started the war with a throw of his spear into the fray. The Vanir, skilled in war magic, breached the walls of Asgard and tore them asunder. Indeed, the Aesir employed a Jotun to rebuild their walls, and he demanded the sun and the moon and Freya as his wife as payment. The Aesir forced Loki to delay the Jotun by a trick so that the work would not be finished in the stipulated time, but this is another story. So this is the Skald beginning his story of the Mead of Poetry. So this is kind of the background to it. So effectively, what we're talking about here, and this comes from, it's mentioned in the Völuspá about the First War, the Aesir and the Vanir War. So the first war in the realms, or in creation, was a war between the two god families, the Aesir and the Vanir. And it started because, pretty sure Odin, and again, I'm going to talk about this in the knowledge video because this is another crossover. There was the first Vanir woman who had access to the Sether magic, right? The female magic of divination, prophecy, telling the future, altering fate. She was the first, Gullveig. And she was killed 3 times, and she kept on being reborn again. And there's strong indication that it was Odin who was the one who killed her, or wanted to kill her. And my own personal idea about this is that he wanted to learn the magic of Sether from her. I believe that there's a bit of confusion as to is when Gullveig was reborn, she became Freya. And then Freya taught the magic of Sether to Odin. We do know that. We do know that Freya taught him that magic, that female magic. So the idea is that Odin kind of facilitated this to happen by murdering this, or not murdering, actually, it wasn't a secret, but by killing this Vanir goddess. And that started the war. It started the Aesir-Vanir war. And I noted here in my little post there that the Vanir were skilled. They were skilled in war magic, and they actually did quite well in the war. The war ended up in effectively a truce, right? Nobody won the war. But the Vanir, with their war magic, they actually tore down the walls of Asgard, and they had to be rebuilt. But that's another story. So there's a story of a Jotun who was basically contracted by the Aesir to rebuild the walls of Asgard after the war, and they got Loki to basically trick him into. He had to do it in a certain amount of time. I forget exactly how much time it was, but the contract was, rebuild the walls of Asgard in this amount of time. I don't know, one year, 1 season, whatever. And his payment was the sun, the moon, and Freya. Everybody seems to want to marry Freya. It happens all the time. I guess she's rather beautiful, so all the Jotun wanted to marry her. But they had Loki trick the guy such that he did not finish the job on time. Therefore, they didn't have to pay him the sun, the moon, and Freya. So, but again, that's another story. But I'm just putting it as the background to the poetry. The Mead of Poetry story. So let's continue with the second post. Eventually, the war ended in a truce between the Vanir and the Aesir. They came together and formed the truce by spitting into a cauldron, and instead of pouring it out later, kept it as a symbol of peace, and formed the spittle into a man whom they named Kvasir. He was the wisest of men and could answer any man, god, or giant's questions with eloquence. In addition to Kvasir, the Vanir and Aesir also exchanged hostages Njálf and his children, Freyja and Freya of the Vanir, were sent to Asgard, where they remain to this day. In exchange, the Aesir gods Mimir and Honir were sent to Vanaheim. Both were considered to be the wisest and smartest of gods, but only when they were together. If Mimir was absent, Honir could only answer questions thusly: let others decide. So the Vanir were tricked. They did not receive the wisest of hostages, only one, Mimir. For this insult, the Vanir killed them both and sent their heads back to Asgard. Odin, of course, famously embalmed the head of Mimir, spoke charms over it, and receives wisdom from Mimir's head even today. But this is another story. So the war ended in a truce between the Vasir and the Aenir, and the Vasir, Aesir and Vanir, and they had a cauldron. They spit, all of the gods would spit into this cauldron as a symbol of peace, and it actually formed into a man, Kvasir. And this man was extremely wise, extremely smart. He could answer any question anybody could put to him. Now, in addition to that, there was an exchange of prisoners, which is a pretty common thing to do at the end of a war. Exchange prisoners to basically guarantee good behavior afterwards. So we're going to end the war. We're going to have a truce. They're going to exchange prisoners, and if you do anything bad to our prisoners, well, then the war starts over again, right? So the Njálf and his children, Freya and Freya, were sent to Asgard as prisoners of the Aesir, even though they were Vanir gods, and they're there to this day. And Mimir and Honir. Honir was, I think, in the Voluspa, 3 gods, when they created humans, they had to give the human like form and soul and intelligence or something. And Honir was one of those gods, one of the gods that gave intelligence or the soul or the form to the human. So the story is something like the gods found like a tree or something, and then they shaped it, and they gave it a soul, they gave it emotions or whatever to make the first humans, right? The first humans in the Voluspa story. Odin was there. He gave, I forget the exact aspects, but Honir was one of those gods to give something to create humans, right? So the part of the exchange deal was that 2 Aesir gods would go to Vanaheim with the Vanir gods, and they were the smartest and wisest of the Aesir gods. So that was the deal. We send you our smartest and our wisest. However, it was not correct because only Mimir was smart and wise. Honir was not. And when they were together, they would be able to answer all the questions and offer good advice and good counsel because, again, Mimir. But if Mimir was off fishing or something, he wasn't there, and they asked Honir questions, he wouldn't be able to answer. He would just say, let others decide. So the Vanir realized that they were tricked and that they hadn't received the best of hostages. So they killed both of them and they sent their heads back. Odin, using his necromancy, so again, connection with Odin as the god of death, he embalmed the head of Mimir to be able to talk to it. And later on, there's other stories of him getting knowledge and getting wisdom from the head of Mimir. Again, crossover with Odin as the god of knowledge. So lots of crossovers here. So, yes, let's move on. Now we're going to get back to, so lots of like asides here. And the reason, of course, is because, that's another story. Because the Skald, the character of the Skald in the game, has a lot of stories to tell, and he's kind of just, letting the audience know that there are more stories that he can tell. But let's get back to the Mead of Poetry. So, Let's read. As for Kvasir, he traveled the world, answering questions and giving out wisdom. However, Kvasir had the misfortune to come across two Duergar brothers, Fjalar and Galar, whom killed Kvasir. The dwarves took Kvasir's blood and mixed it with honey to make the Mead of Poetry in 3 containers, which, if drunk, moves a person to passion, speech, and eloquence. Fjalar and Galar sent a message to the Aesir to report that Kvasir choked on his own knowledge because there was no one smart enough to ask a question which he could not answer. The Duergar brothers got up to more mischief later on when they drowned the Jotun Gilling and dropped a millstone on the head of his wife and killed her too. Their son, Suttungr, tracked them down, the brothers, tortured them, and demanded the Mead of Poetry as compensation for the death of his parents. Suttungr took the 3 containers of mead and hid them in a mountain in Jotunheim named Bjorg, and got his daughter Gunlund to guard it. All right, so there's a lot here. Again, I'm paraphrasing from the story in the Prose Edda, chapter 5 and chapter 6. I'm paraphrasing here, right? They go into a lot more detail in the actual poem, right, or the actual story. So the man, Kvasir, super wise, knows everything. He's not like a hostage in Asgard. He goes out into the world, travels different places, giving out wisdom, answering questions, and then he has I wrote Duergar, and I think that's probably wrong. Duergar, of course, is a D&D term. It means the gray dwarves, but Duergar, I think I wrote, yeah, it should actually be Duergar, so I actually made a mistake there. Duergar being another word for dwarves, right? So 2 dwarf brothers find him, kill him, and they mix his blood, so the blood of this wise person, Kvasir, to create the Mead of Poetry, and they put it into 3 containers. And the story tells the exact names of these 3 containers, and they have different functions, which I didn't get into the into this part of it. So the dwarves kill Kvasir. They said, the funny thing is, and this is again directly from the poem, from the story, they sent a message to the Aesir and said that he's dead because he choked on his own knowledge because no one could tell him a story he couldn't answer. But it is pretty funny. And then later on, there's some issue with Gilling, a giant, a Jotun. I think they brought him to an island and they left him there. And then, of course, the tide came in and he drowned. And his wife, they dropped a rock on her head and killed her. Again, not entirely sure why they did that. So these dwarves were up to no good, basically, right? So they kill Kvasir, they kill the giant, they kill his wife. And then the son of the 2 giants that were killed tracks them down, finds them, and wants compensation for the killing of his parents. I'd have to check, but he may have also killed the dwarves as well. I'm not entirely sure about that. I'd have to check. But now we have the Suttungr has the Mead of Poetry, and he whisks it away back to Jotunheim, to his mountain, let's call it a mountain fortress or something. And he has his daughter, Gunlund, to guard it. Okay, now finally, after all of this, now Odin is going to get involved. So let's go to the next passage to read. Odin got wind of this mead and wanted it for himself. He disguised himself, went under the name Bolverker, and traveled to Jotunheim. He had a plan. He found a field where 9 thralls were working. He produced a whetstone, which could sharpen the tools of the thralls to make their jobs much more efficient. The thralls wanted the whetstone, and Bolverkr said, "Whomever is still standing when this whetstone hits the ground can have it." He threw the whetstone up into the air, and the 9 thralls killed each other with their scythes to be the last one standing. Bolverkr caught the whetstone and went on his way. He went to the home of Bogi, brother of Suttungr, who was the owner of the 9 dead thralls. Bogi needed workers to plow the fields, and Bolverkr said that he could do the work of the 9 men for the summer if Bogi helped Bolverkr get a drink of the Mead of Poetry from his brother. Bogi agreed. So, Odin learns about this Mead of Poetry. Keep on getting tongue-tied about saying these words. So he finds out about it. He wants it for himself so again, tie with the knowledge part of Odin, because Kvaerser was not only elegant, he was wise. He knew. There was no answer. There was no question that he could not answer. So the Mead of Poetry was made from his blood. So Odin wanted the Mead of Poetry, not just for the poetry, but also for the knowledge that it imparted, right? It made you really smart, and you knew a lot of stuff, right? So it was a connection with knowledge, right? He disguised himself, because that's what Odin always does, and he always picks a name. Now, this name is hilarious. Bolverkr, it means evil one or evil doer, to do evil. What a weird name to give yourself and then go talk with people and interact with people. I'm evil. I'm an evil doer. I'm going to do evil things. Strange name, but that's what Bolverkr means. Evil doer. So crazy name. He goes to Jotunheim, and his plan is to basically get a favor from Suttungr's brother, Bogi, and he kills 9 thralls. A whetstone, of course, is something that you'd sharpen a tool or a weapon with to make it really, to be more efficient, right? So I got this whetstone. It's super, super magical or whatever. This will make your work really, really easy, because you'd have a super sharp scythe to do your work. And whoever wants it, whoever's left alive after I throw it up in the air, you can have it. And the 9 thralls, again, always 9. 9 is always the number. The 9 thralls kill each other. So Odin collects his whetstone and then talks to Bogi. Is like, "Oh, you need work done, do you? You're missing your thralls. They're all dead. I can do the work." And he did. Odin worked through the summer doing the work of 9 thralls. And then Bogi then, of course, because of the rules of like hospitality and honesty and everything, Bogi would be, of course, he would need to talk to his brother about allowing this Bolverkr guy a drink of the Mead of Poetry, right? So that was the plan. Let's continue. Okay, so the next post. Bolverkr did the work over the summer, and Bogi went to Suttungr and asked him for a drink of the mead to give to his farmhand, Bolverkr. But Suttungr refused his brother's request. Bolverkr and Bogi needed to try something else. They went to the outside of the mountain, Bjorg, and used Rati and auger to drill through the mountain towards the room where the mead was being kept. Bolverkr turned himself into a snake and slithered through the hole created by the drill. He came into the room guarded by Gunnlod, changed back into human form, and seduced her for 3 nights. Each night, Bolverkr drank from one of the containers holding the Mead of Poetry, but he did not sip or take a hornful. He drank them entirely. Okay, so when Bogi talks to his brother about allowing this Bolverkr guy to drink from some of the mead, Suttungr refused. I don't remember why he refused, but he refused. So he had to do something different, right? Because he wasn't just gonna be given it. He had to go get it in another way. So Odin and Bogi start drilling a hole into the side of the mountain. That's what an auger is, right? It's a tool for drilling holes. And there's something extra which I didn't include here, but kind of like halfway, I forget the exact story. I'll have to actually let me pause this video and then go have a look, because there's some part of this story that I'm forgetting right now. So give me a second. Okay, so the extra part I'm missing was that actually Boggy was the one drilling the hole, and twice Odin blew into the hole, but the chips came back, like the chips of, you know, pieces of like rock or whatever from the drilling of the hole into the mountain. They came back at him, which means the hole wasn't completed, right? If he drilled right through and you blow through, the chips would go into the mountain, not back at you. Bogey said, yeah, it's finished. Go ahead. You can go in. But when Odin tested it by blowing in, the chips came back at him. So basically, Boggy was lying to him. It does say that when Odin turned himself into a snake to go into the hole, Boggy tried to attack him. He tried to hit him with the auger, right? But he missed. And that's all that we have about Boggy there. So that kind of ends that part. So that's what I missed. So I guess not particularly important. But anyway, so, right. Okay, so now Odin is turned into a snake. He's gone through the hole created by Augur. He's now inside of the mountain fortress of Suttungr. And he goes to the room where the Mead of Poetry is protected by Gunnlod, Suttungr's daughter. And, you know, Odin seduces her. And it's always 3 nights. Every time people are sleeping together, it's always 3 nights. We saw this already with, I don't know if you're watching it, the videos about the saga of the Volsungs, where Signy got changed into the form of a witch, and then she stayed with her brother Sigmund because she wanted to get pregnant, and it was 3 nights that they stayed together, right? It's always 3 nights. And the story with Rig as Heimdall, he's also spending 3 nights with the different, the grandmother, the mother, to get the 3 social classes, the Jarl, Carl, and Thrall. So it's also 3 nights, right? It's always 3 nights. It's never 1 night. So anyway, but it's also connected here with the 3 nights because there are 3 containers for the Mead of Poetry. So first night, Odin drinks one of the containers. Next night, he drinks the next container. Now, he doesn't drink a little bit. He drinks the whole thing. He drinks all of it. So he's stealing all of the Mead of Poetry, the entire stuff. Not really sure what Gunnlod is doing. Gunnlod is doing at this time. I guess she's asleep, I suppose. Okay, so let's continue. Bolverkr, Odin, needed to escape from the mountain, turned himself into an eagle, and flew out, heading towards Asgard. Suttungr gave chase, also in the form of an eagle. It was a great chase, and at one point, Suttungr had almost caught Odin. So Odin defecated out defiled mead into Suttungr's face. That shitty mead fell upon the land, and it is said that any who drank from it, called Skaldskaparmál, the portion for poet fools, are the bad poets of the world today. Odin escaped Suttungr and arrived at Asgard, where he vomited up the Mead of Poetry into a cauldron the Aesir prepared. And thus the Aesir have the Mead of Poetry, and they give it to whom pleases them. Suttungr arrived in Asgard the next day to ask about Bolverkr and what became of him, but that is another story. All right, so that's the end of that. So Odin's escaping. He turns himself in. Remember, so all the Mead of Poetry is basically in his stomach, right? It hasn't been digested. It's in his stomach. It's in his stomach. So he, assumedly, I would assume he turned into a snake to crawl back out the hole again, and then once he was on the other end, he turned into an eagle and he flew, flying towards Asgard. And the giant, of course, Suttungr, he doesn't want this to happen, so he gives chase. Now, I took a little bit of poetic license here about the Odin shitting in the face of Suttungr. That's a little bit of poetic license, but I can show you the Norse where I got that idea from. So from the Norse, it says, I got it here up on the screen. Let me try to pronounce it. At hein sendi after suman Mjolfodin. So this is after is back some mead. So basically, Odin sent back some mead, or the mead went backwards. So backwards, he's flying as an eagle. Where's the mead going to come from if it's backwards? So I'm assuming it's out of his ass. So he defecated. So the idea was that Suttungr is chasing him, right? So you got two eagles flying, and Suttungr is trying to catch up to him. Once he gets really close and he's almost caught Odin just farts out mead to kind of distract Suttungr, hit him in the face, and some of this mead falls down to Midgard, right? And this defiled mead, which is, again, directly, they give a name for it. Pronunciation is something like Skáldskaparmál, Hjulter, which is the portion for poet fools. So if you're a bad poet, if you're really bad at poetry, that means you picked up some of this defecated mead from Odin as an eagle, and that's what you drank. So you don't have any particular skill at poetry because you drank the bad stuff, effectively, right? So Odin gets back. So this little distraction of shitting in the face of Suttungr, again, my interpretation. I don't know how clear that is. So Odin gets back to Asgard, turns back into himself, and he vomits out all of the contents of his stomach into a cauldron, and now we have the Mead of Poetry. And this Mead of Poetry, now belonging to the Aesir, they would give out as a gift. The example from the role-playing game that I was running was that at a wedding feast, for example, the guests at the wedding feast would be allowed to drink a little bit of the Mead of Poetry, and then, of course, they would be able to speak passionately, eloquently, with wisdom and intelligence. That's the gift of the gods, effectively, right? Now, so again, Odin as the god of poetry is all connected with this, right? Because he's the one who, through all of this long story I've just told, got the Mead of Poetry, right? So remember, all of this paraphrasing I'm doing here comes from Skáldskaparmál, chapter 5 and chapter 6. I'm not going to go through the actual those two chapters because I just did in a paraphrased way, in a more entertaining way, I think. So let me recap a little bit about Odin as the god of poetry. Okay, so there's three things that I would talk about here. So particularly in the Poetic Edda, there's various poems which have kind of like a poetic kind of slant to them. Vald through the Small, Grimna Small, Locusena, and the last one I have really trouble pronouncing, Harboth. Never mind, can't even pronounce it. So these poems involve with Odin in engaging in riddles or stories or poetry. So there's a connection there. The second connection with Odin as the god of poetry is skaldic poetry, was the entertainment of the kings and jarls, and Odin is he is worshipped by the nobility, the kings, and the jarls. He is their god. The common peasant, the common man, the common Viking was probably worshipping Freya, Thor, Njolf, the god of the sea, because that's the stuff that involved them on a regular basis, right? So Odin was the god of the kings, right? And skaldic poetry was only done for them. They were the ones who were, entertaining skalds in their in their castles, or I don't know if they had castles, but in their longhouses or their homes or their villages, right? So that connection. And of course, the strongest connection with Odin as the god of poetry is the Mead of Poetry story, Skáldskaparmál, chapters 5 and 6 from the Prose Edda, if you want to go through that in detail. I just basically paraphrased it through my role-playing example. So I think this was a long video. And I'm pretty sure that the next video, Odin as the god of knowledge, is going to be even longer because there's a lot there. There is a lot there. And that is my primary focus. I am interested in knowledge. I like knowing things. I want to know things, and I want to disseminate, give out, teach that knowledge. That's why I am a teacher. That's what I do. That is my focus. And that's my particular focus in Odin is as the god of knowledge. Poetry, I read the poems. I'm not able to compose any poems. It's too complicated, especially skaldic poetry. But I read them. I find them interesting because there's a lot of knowledge to be learned in those poems, right? So there's that knowledge. And of course, Odin as the god of death, it's something that comes to all of us. So obviously there's that. But knowledge is my focus, right? So that's going to be the longest video I'll make, and from my own perspective, the most interesting. So, long video. Thank you for watching. I hope you made it this far. And thank you. And I'll see you in the next Norse-related video. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.